Al said at the beginning that everyone here should be an advocate. So I'm going to ask you all for some opinions along the lines of advocacy. Because what are we doing here today? And much of those assembled today have been here before. There were a few who raised their hands that they'd never been here before, which is great. But we are sometimes guilty of preaching to the choir. We have a great choir, don't get me wrong. So I have two questions, and I'm going to ask you to give your opinion on the answers. And the first one is very simple. Can we agree on what we are advocating? What are we advocating? What is our focus for advocacy? There were a lot of words used today. I've heard connections, changing paradigm, corridors, not one size fits all. Technology should not drag policy making. What are we advocating? What is our advocacy position? I'm going to call on you if you don't raise your hand. Okay, I don't see any hands. So I'm going to ask Jeff Morales. Did he leave? That was smart of him. Jeff is not here anymore. Okay. I have a list of people I was going to call upon, but I forgot to check to see whether they were still in the room. All right. What are we advocating? You're going to change the question. Okay. Mr. Spaethling.
Stan, are you asking what is APTA advocating? What is Dominic? What is
What
Stan?
is the industry advocating? It
Yeah,
could be. All right, let's say, what is APTA advocating?
All right. So I think it's interesting throughout the morning, as you said, a lot of food for thought. I think one of the things that we should be, as a committee and as APTA and as the participants here, is really understanding and making the connection between what we're hearing from our panelists, which are very project or corridor specific, and how do we connect the regions and these regional initiatives to what's happening at a federal level. So what we have learned, the tipping point has been this whole discussion over the last few years has been very federal focused. But what we're seeing and what is evidenced today is we're seeing a lot of initiatives happening at the regional/state level. And, how do we connect the dots here between and really helping regions grow to what, and then bringing that all together and leading that to a federal discussion. Because I think, as we know, we've suffered through the waves of federal involvement in high-speed rail advocacy or funding, but we're seeing that it's going on anyway. It's happening in Florida, it's happening in Texas. So I think we have to, instead of be looking to Washington, we should be looking more regionally. And what are we doing? And I think that's a question, is how do we do that through this organization? How is APTA positioned to help with regional advocacy?
Thank you, Dominic. Anna.
I'm going to suggest a couple of lessons learned from the two major transit projects we've had in Connecticut in the last 6 years. We mentioned earlier our CT Fast Track BRT and the Hartford line. And what we learned in central Connecticut, which is not a transit-oriented area, is that we had to teach people what it meant for them. Why is this important to me? We had to initiate a substantial branding and marketing effort that said, how will this affect my life? How will it make my life better? And we did that by showing people how they'd get to work, how they'd get to play, how their families could be richer, how they could get to school, recreational opportunities, all in a very realistic and approachable and understandable way to folks that weren't really transit users. And you can build it all you want, but you have to make sure that the people, if they're not used to the message and not used to the mode, understand what's in it for me. And I think that our advocacy at some level, we need to either do it or get someone else to do it to start to tell people why high-speed rail matters to them.
Thank you. Peter, do you want to say something?
Sure.
That would be odd.
Oh, jeez. Thanks, Dan. So my point is clearly a high-speed rail advocate and evangelist, but I think what we are asking for, or what we're talking about, is not high-speed rail specifically or higher performance rail. We're talking about a system, a network, and connections, right? It's not about high-speed rail in a vacuum and as a silo of opportunity. It's about how do we connect cities, how do we connect the last mile, how do we connect regions, of which high-speed rail plays a part of it, connected to other important parts like other transit systems and local systems.
Thank you, Peter. I think that was another valuable comment. Floyd, what do you think about this advocacy thing? You have an interest, you have a union interest in it. What is your thought about what we should be advocating? Floyd Mason.
I think we should be promoting city-to-city passenger rail transportation.
City-to-city passenger rail services. That's a good distinction. Anyone else have a point of view on this? Yes, Mr. Edelman.
I'm Rich Edelman, counsel for the Signalman and Brotherhood of Maintenance Way employees. I want to raise a point about defensive advocacy, which is the question of the Koch brothers went in and campaigned against transit in Nashville, and they tried to do it in Albuquerque. How to respond to that? And they had paid canvassers going door to door, oftentimes spreading lies about what was going to go on, and where's the capability to answer that? Now, labor can actually provide boots on the ground to do that, but it's not going to do it if it gets cut out of the process and if the statutes that protect working people and their rights are evaded. So labor can help answer that call, but it needs to be part of the process.
Thank you for pointing out the partnership between labor and the rest of us. Thank you. Is Ventuano in the room, or did he escape? My whole list. I'm sure he'll be back.
I'm not
So
on your list.
I'm going to make since I want to go to a second question, I'm going to make my own point of view.
I'm not even here.
Oh, I didn't see you at the, I'm sorry, Sharon. Will you forgive me? This time. Okay. Sharon, please.
Well, what's the second question? Maybe my comment is more appropriate for the second question.
You rose for the first question.
In terms of advocacy, I think we have a number of good stories now, and it's a question of, are those stories upping the expectation that all high-speed or intercity rail projects should match the abilities of Texas and Brightline? And not all projects are just going to be able to get by with low-interest government loans. And it sets a standard. Norm Ford talked about the project, the Purple Line. Well, Purple Line wouldn't be going ahead if there wasn't public funding to repay the private investment. And I think that we have to be careful as we go ahead with advocating for federal role in these projects. What is a realistic expectation? Because there's a whole hierarchy of need on these projects.
Thank you. So what I was going to say is I'd like us to become technology neutral. We should be advocating for improved, and it's been said, I'm repeating other remarks, improved transportation between our major urban areas. The demographer, Mr. Alexander, showed us some very interesting things this morning. Mike, thank you. And our investments in improving intercity transportation will have an impact on those predictions. Those predictions are kind of steady state. This is what's going to happen. But if we make investments in improving access between major cities and some minor ones as well, we will have an impact on how our economic growth proceeds and our population changes. So we should be advocating intercity corridors, linking metropolitan areas with new and expanded high-performance rail service. You choose the mode, you choose the technology, because it's not about technology, it's about making improvements to the linkages and connections between cities. Okay, second question. And the second question is an obvious follow-on. Whatever we decide our focus is and what we're advocating, how can we expand on our advocacy? How can we engage a wider variety of interests in what we're advocating? How do we find champions where they are needed? How do we make the choir a hell of a lot bigger? Okay, David Carroll.
I would love to comment at least briefly on your two questions, because they sort of blend. Karen talked a lot about Seattle, Vancouver, and if you notice in the way she described it, she never mentioned a mode of transportation, just high-speed transportation between the two cities. And one of the remarkable things there in the way that program has been discussed is how do we achieve 1 hour service between these two cities in order to economically integrate them. We have tended to sell high-speed rail, I think, as the end instead of the means. And I think the more, to your second question, the more we can sell what the vision of what we're trying to achieve, probably economically or culturally or societally, in linking two cities. There are very few people that can get between Seattle, very few modes that can get between Seattle and Vancouver other than high-speed rail in an hour, unless you want to grow airport capacity. So we don't even have to mention the word rail, but if we sell 1 hour service between the two cities and the benefits that come from that, rail will follow. Rail has, for whatever reason, been a lightning rod. We as an industry allowed it to become a political issue. I think the only way we solve that in the near term is to to some extent, stop selling the means, sell the end product, the growth, the benefits that you get from it, and let rail be the ultimate solution for
Thank you,
achieving
David. I think that's an excellent point, and it echoes things that were said about that corridor, and Anna's point about helping people understand their benefits, the benefits they get from these things. Mort Downey, please.
It's been said already this morning, but let me say it again. Transportation is strictly a means to the end. We have to spend more time on what are the opportunities that are created. If you can get between places faster, what does it mean to your life? What does it mean to your choices of job? What does it mean to keeping a family together when they are spread over hundreds of miles? What does it mean in terms of cultural opportunities? We really need to sell what does it mean in your life, not why would it be cool to ride a train?
Thank you, Mort. How do we increase our advocacy? I'm looking for the next speaker. Sandy?
Go ahead, Laura.
Okay, I don't know
Hi.
your name.
Laura from Quandle Consultants.
Laura.
So in discussing advocacy, we have to look at the segments and find common archetypes, roughly about 3. So who are the people to most demand the service, and how do we sell it to them and teach them how to gain the advocacy? They will have common characteristics within these segments, and that is a way that you can truly sell the product. I'm speaking of example for a report that I did for Brunswick on Mercury Marina. We targeted the nostalgic boaters, those who grew up with them. We then targeted those who seek experiences, and then the outdoor enthusiasts. And by targeting those 3 personas, those 3 groups brought in more people. Word of mouth.
Thank you. We heard from the National Governors Association this morning. We heard from people who represent governors and regional councils, and we were talking about how they're coming to town. Peter Pizer made sure that we understood the schedule of their arrival in Washington. And there's a target. There's a target that actually is very, very meaningful. And that was part of the Cascade stories. It was the governors, it was the mayors. We need to expand our tent in terms of whatever we are advocating to include the local elected officials who understand what makes sense for their communities. And the point being made about self-interest, people's lives are affected by changing their access and their ability to move from place to place. And I think that we have an opportunity to encourage a larger number of advocacy organizations as we stress the change in connectivity and in access and in higher speeds between cities. Anyone else? Sandy, you are going to get up.
Yeah. Thanks, Stan. You know, I've said this a lot to individuals, but I haven't said it to a group. And I was with the High Speed Ground Transportation Association, and we really talked about steel wheel, high-speed rail, and maglev. That was its purpose. When we came into APTA, we kind of stuck with this high-speed rail committee and high-speed rail, but we're not high-speed rail. We're high-speed rail, I guess if you look at Texas and California, but Brightline isn't high-speed rail, it's inner-city rail. So we go to the Hill, we talk to our elected officials who, mind you, they're not experts like we are, and we're using high-speed rail and inner-city rail, and they're getting really confused. They don't know, well, what are we? What are you, high-speed rail? Or what are you, inner-city rail? And I'll tell you, it really hurts us. When I was in Fort Lauderdale for the Ash Show conference with Anna and Lauren, we rode Brightline, and it was fabulous. And I was with this young man who wasn't in the industry, who just got back from China and was in Shanghai and rode maglev. And he had an app. And he said when he rode the maglev project or train, it went like 220 miles per hour. And he heard that Brightline was a high-speed rail train. So he thought it was going to go 180, 150 miles per hour. Well, Brightline only goes about 50. And he was laughing. He said, you know, you called this high-speed rail. This isn't high-speed rail. This is embarrassing. And I'm like, no, this isn't high-speed rail. It's inner-city rail. So we really got to make sure we know what we're talking about, because we are confusing our stakeholders, we're confusing our elected officials, and we're confusing the public. And so we really need to define what we are doing. And again, when I see high-speed rail, when people talk about Brightline, you know, I really just kind of cringe, because it's not high-speed rail, it's inner-city rail. So anyway, I just want to make that point. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Sandy. You made my point, too. Al?
Well, there's all kinds of collaboration that could work. You know, we haven't talked about utilities, and we haven't talked about the retired People's Association, that kind of thing. But back to your first point, we're not advocating for a technology, Stan. I mean, you've been with us long enough. We're advocating for a mode, an intercity rail mode. There are many different technologies that can operate on a highway, which isn't a technology. It's a mode using the highway. We've got diesels, electrics, and whatnot running on a highway. But the argument for the investment varies from corridor to corridor. In California, when we were really pitching the passage of the referendum, we used radio spots during those peak periods. And we told people, wouldn't you like to ride a high-speed rail system instead of sitting in your car and not moving? And it worked. You know, the referendum passed. One of our speakers said it's about economic development, which is really what we're talking about, sustaining economic development. So the argument can vary depending on the corridor. Mike brought up the fact that housing is getting very expensive in certain regions. High-speed rail in this mode can shrink geography substantially. I'd like to point out the example of the Madrid-Seville corridor. It created brand-new suburbs because people were able to get into Madrid using the high-speed rail system. So there are different kinds of constituencies you can speak to depending on the corridor. Brightline, even though it doesn't go 150 miles an hour and it isn't cool, I think it is pretty cool. And it does allow you to comfortably travel to these tourist centers. But I think the speed is important in some corridors. The trip time is important. The shrinkage of geography, getting people some affordable housing that's a half an hour away, even though it might be 100 miles from the employment center. So we don't have one argument that fits all corridors. It has to be tailored to the situation. And nor do we have a financial model that fits all corridors. We look at the Interstate Highway Program, which had a heavy federal involvement. We look at the mass transit program. I think there's still an important role. We can't get carried away with totally private systems. The federal government still has a funding role and an overall, planning and regulatory role. So anyway.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to just end by answering my own question, as I did before. We have to enlarge the advocacy tent away from just public transit people, us. We have to focus on downtown businesses, chambers of commerce. We have to focus on suppliers, constructors, people who have an economic interest in improving intercity rail, whether it's greenfield or brownfield. We have to focus on that new freshman class in Congress. Every one of us who has a new congressperson who's coming to Congress and doesn't have a lot of awareness of the key issues, you have a role to play in educating those fine young people. And we have to focus on the governors and the mayors. We can't leave them out. They have to be in. And they're not here, except for the two people who represented elected officials. So those are ways that we can expand our tent. We've made a lot of points. We have a new paradigm, perhaps, when we look at the projects that are coming online and their customer focus. Brightline is definitely the most customer-focused new project in America, and I'm sure the Texas Central project will take its points from the Virgin trains. Thank you very much.